Join us on a gripping journey into the minds of two of America's most notorious killers, Wade Wilson, the Deadpool killer, and Ted Bundy, the infamous serial murderer. Discover how their early lives shaped their twisted paths, the chilling similarities in their crimes, and the psychological profiles that baffled experts. Unravel the societal impacts of their actions and explore how their cases forever changed law enforcement. Stay tuned for an unforgettable exploration of evil.
Wade Wilson and Ted Bundy, despite the decades that separate them, share some intriguing similarities in their early lives that may have contributed to their later actions. Wade Wilson, known as the Deadpool killer, grew up in a turbulent environment in Tallahassee, Florida. Raised in a household where domestic violence was present, he exhibited early signs of aggression and antisocial behavior. From a young age, Wilson was known to be involved in fights at school and showed little remorse for his actions. His fascination with violence and a lack of positive role models set the stage for his future crimes. In contrast, Ted Bundy was born in Burlington, Vermont, and raised in Tacoma, Washington. Bundy's early life was marked by deception. He believed his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. This family secret contributed to his feelings of alienation and resentment. Unlike Wilson, Bundy was seen as charming and intelligent, often masking his darker impulses. He excelled in academics but struggled with feelings of inadequacy and anger, which simmered beneath his charismatic exterior. Both Wilson and Bundy showed early signs of psychological disturbances. Wilson's aggression and Bundy's manipulative tendencies foreshadowed their later crimes. Interestingly, both displayed a fascination with violent media, which may have desensitized them to real-world violence. Bundy's obsession with detective magazines that depicted violent crimes, and Wilson's penchant for violent video games and movies, reveal a shared interest in brutality. Despite different upbringings, both killers exhibited a lack of empathy and remorse, critical traits in understanding their criminal behavior. Their early life experiences highlight the complex interplay of nature and nurture in shaping violent tendencies. These parallels in their backgrounds suggest that a combination of environmental influences and psychological predispositions may have played a role in their development as killers. While Bundy used his charm to lure victims, Wilson's approach was more direct and brutal, reflecting their different psychological makeups. However, both showed an ability to hide their true natures from those around them, which allowed them to evade capture for a time. Their early lives set the stage for their later crimes, providing crucial insights into how such individuals develop into serial offenders. Wade Wilson's crime spree began on October 7, 2019, in Cape Coral, Florida, where he brutally murdered two women, Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz, in a single day. Wilson's attacks were characterized by their impulsive nature and sheer brutality. He strangled Melton in her home and then stole her car. Later that day, he ran over Ruiz multiple times with the stolen vehicle, leaving her body severely mutilated. In comparison, Ted Bundy's crimes were more calculated and methodical. Bundy was active primarily in the 1970s and was known for his ability to blend into his surroundings and use his charm to lure victims. One of his infamous crimes involved luring a young woman from a crowded beach in broad daylight by pretending to be injured and needing help. He often approached his victims with a fake injury or disability, exploiting their empathy to gain their trust before attacking them. Both killers targeted women, but their methods reflected different psychological profiles. Wilson's crimes were spontaneous and fueled by rage, while Bundy's were premeditated and manipulative. Despite these differences, both killers demonstrated a complete disregard for human life and an ability to evade detection initially. The murder of Diane Ruiz by Wade Wilson bears some similarity to Ted Bundy's abduction of Georgianne Hawkins. Both victims were young women going about their daily routines when they were suddenly attacked. Hawkins was abducted while walking through an alleyway near her college dormitory. Bundy later confessed to hitting her on the head and taking her to a secluded location, where he killed her. Similarly, Ruiz was targeted as she walked to work, routine task that turned deadly due to Wilson's violent impulses. Forensic evidence played a crucial role in linking Wilson to his crimes, much like it did in Bundy's case. Advances in DNA technology and surveillance footage were instrumental in identifying Wilson as the perpetrator, while Bundy's eventual capture was aided by eyewitness accounts and his own mistakes, such as leaving behind a distinctive bite mark on a victim. Understanding the psychological makeup of Wade Wilson and Ted Bundy provides insights into their motivations and behaviors. Wade Wilson exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, including a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and aggression. His history of domestic violence and early exposure to a chaotic home environment likely contributed to his violent tendencies. Wilson's use of violence as a means of exerting control and instilling fear suggests deep-seated issues with power and dominance. His tattoos, including swastikas and symbols of aggression, point to a desire to project a menacing image. During his trial, his demeanor was described as indifferent, yet beneath the surface, he likely experienced significant anxiety and stress, as indicated by his body language. Ted Bundy, on the other hand, is often cited as a textbook case of psychopathy. He exhibited a charming and manipulative exterior that concealed his complete lack of empathy and remorse. Bundy's intelligence and charisma allowed him to deceive those around him, making him a particularly dangerous predator. He derived pleasure from manipulating his victims and the attention he received from the media. Both Wilson and Bundy demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize their violent actions, showing little to no emotional response to their crimes. This detachment is a hallmark of their psychological disorders, allowing them to act without guilt or fear of consequences. The psychological analysis of both killers reveals a complex interplay of innate traits and environmental factors. While Bundy's crimes were driven by a need for power and control, Wilson's actions were more impulsive and chaotic, reflecting different manifestations of similar psychological issues. Understanding their psychological profiles helps law enforcement and mental health professionals develop strategies for identifying and managing individuals with similar traits. This knowledge is crucial for preventing future crimes and providing effective intervention for those at risk of following a similar path. The crimes of Wade Wilson and Ted Bundy had profound impacts on society and law enforcement practices. Wilson's case, occurring in the digital age, highlighted the importance of surveillance technology and forensic advancements in solving violent crimes. The use of DNA evidence and security footage was pivotal in his conviction, underscoring the need for modern investigative techniques. In contrast, Bundy's crimes in the 1970s challenged law enforcement to develop new methods for tracking and apprehending serial killers. His ability to evade capture for years led to the development of criminal profiling and the creation of national databases to track serial offenders. Both cases raised awareness about the importance of recognizing early warning signs of violent behavior. Wilson's case emphasized the need for better mental health interventions and monitoring of individuals with known violent tendencies. It also sparked discussions about the role of medications, such as SSRIs, in influencing behavior. Bundy's trial was a media spectacle that changed the way the public perceived serial killers. His charm and intelligence captivated audiences, highlighting the need for media responsibility in covering such cases. The public fascination with Bundy's trial set a precedent for how high-profile criminal cases are reported and consumed. The societal impact of these cases extends to the victims' families and communities. Both cases left lasting scars, prompting efforts to support survivors and prevent future tragedies. Community outreach programs and victim advocacy became integral parts of the response to such crimes. In the wake of Wilson's and Bundy's actions, law enforcement agencies have placed greater emphasis on collaboration and information sharing. The establishment of task forces and specialized units dedicated to handling serial crimes reflects the lessons learned from these notorious cases. Ultimately, the legacy of Wade Wilson and Ted Bundy lies in the changes they prompted in both societal awareness and law enforcement practices. Their stories serve as cautionary tales and reminders of the importance of vigilance, understanding, and proactive measures in the fight against violent crime.
Two of America's most infamous killers, Wade Wilson, the Deadpool killer, and Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, both men unleashed terror on their victims, but what drove their twisted minds? Join us as we dive deep into the chilling similarities and haunting differences between these two predators, revealing the dark psychology that fueled their horrific crimes. This is a journey into pure evil, don't miss it.
Wade Wilson and Richard Ramirez, though separated by decades, share eerie similarities in their backgrounds that foreshadowed their descent into violence. Wade Wilson, known as the Deadpool Killer, was born in Tallahassee, Florida, and grew up in an environment marked by domestic violence and instability. His early years were fraught with exposure to aggressive behavior, leading to his own issues with anger and impulsivity. From a young age, Wilson displayed signs of aggression, often getting into fights at school and showing little remorse for his actions. His troubled upbringing left deep scars that would later manifest in his brutal crimes. In contrast, Richard Ramirez, who would become infamous as the Night Stalker, was born on February 29, 1960. In El Paso, Texas, Ramirez's early life was marked by a similar exposure to violence and instability. He was the youngest of 5 children in a family struggling with poverty and domestic abuse. His father, a former police officer, was prone to violent outbursts, which deeply affected young Richard. Adding to the turmoil, Ramirez was influenced by his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who exposed him to graphic stories of violence and even showed him photographs of the atrocities he committed during the war. This early exposure to brutality had a profound impact on Ramirez, warping his perception of violence and death. Both Wilson and Ramirez exhibited troubling behaviors during their adolescence. Wilson's anger and aggression escalated as he grew older, leading to run-ins with the law and the pattern of increasingly violent behavior. Similarly, Ramirez began experimenting with drugs and delving into satanic worship during his teenage years, further distancing himself from any sense of normalcy. The lack of positive role models and the constant exposure to violence set both individuals on a path toward darkness. Despite their troubled upbringings, both Wilson and Ramirez were able to mask their true natures to some extent. Wilson, though prone to outbursts, was able to maintain a facade of normalcy, much like Ramirez, who was described by some as charming and even likable when he wasn't committing his heinous acts. This ability to blend into society while harboring violent tendencies made both men particularly dangerous. The early life experiences of Wade Wilson and Richard Ramirez highlight the complex interplay of environmental factors and psychological predispositions that can lead to the development of violent tendencies. While each had unique circumstances, the common threads of violence, instability, and the lack of positive influences are evident in their backgrounds, setting the stage for their eventual descent into serial killing. Wade Wilson's crime spree began on October 7, 2019, in Cape Coral, Florida, where he brutally murdered 2 women, Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz, within the span of a single day. Wilson's attacks were characterized by their impulsive nature and extreme brutality. He strangled Melton in her home, leaving her lifeless body in her bed, and then stole her car. Later that day, he ran over Ruiz multiple times with the stolen vehicle, leaving her body mutilated beyond recognition. Wilson's crimes were marked by a frenzied rage, seemingly driven by a desire to exert control and inflict pain. Richard Ramirez, on the other hand, operated in a more methodical yet equally terrifying manner. During his reign of terror in Los Angeles and San Francisco, from 1984 to 1985, Ramirez broke into homes at night, often while the occupants were asleep. He would attack his victims with a variety of weapons, including guns, knives, and hammers, showing no mercy regardless of age or gender. Ramirez's crimes were not just about killing, they were about instilling fear. He would often leave satanic symbols at the crime scenes, taunting both the victims and the police. His victims ranged from young children to elderly adults, making his attacks unpredictable and heightening the sense of terror. Despite their different methods, both Wilson and Ramirez targeted vulnerable victims, primarily women, and both killers derived a sense of power from the fear and pain they inflicted. Wilson's impulsive brutality contrasted with Ramirez's calculated cruelty, but both approaches were rooted in a profound disregard for a human life. Their crimes left communities in a state of fear and shock, as the randomness and savagery of their attacks made anyone a potential target. The murder of Diane Ruiz by Wade Wilson bears some similarities to Richard Ramirez's home invasion murders. Both victims were unsuspecting and going about their daily lives when they were suddenly attacked. Ramirez, known for entering homes in the dead of night, struck fear into the hearts of residents who believed their homes to be safe havens. Wilson's attack on Ruiz, as she walked to work, shattered the sense of safety in public spaces, leaving the community reeling. Forensic evidence played a crucial role in linking both Wilson and Ramirez to their respective crimes. Advances in DNA technology and surveillance footage were instrumental in identifying Wilson, the perpetrator, much like Ramirez's eventual capture, which was aided by fingerprint evidence and a tip from a vigilant community member. The capture of both killers brought a sense of relief to the terrorized communities, but the scars left by their actions would linger long after their arrests. Understanding the psychological makeup of Wade Wilson and Richard Ramirez provides deeper insights into their motivations and behaviors. Wade Wilson exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, including a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and aggression. His history of domestic violence and early exposure to a chaotic home environment likely contributed to his violent tendencies. Wilson's use of violence as a means of exerting control and instilling fear suggests deep-seated issues with power and dominance. His tattoos, including swastikas and symbols of aggression, point to a desire to project a menacing image. During his trial, his demeanor was described as indifferent, yet beneath the surface, he likely experienced significant anxiety and stress, as indicated by his body language. Richard Ramirez, on the other hand, is often cited as a textbook case of psychopathy. He exhibited a charming and manipulative exterior that concealed his complete lack of empathy and remorse. Ramirez's intelligence and charisma allowed him to deceive those around him, making him a particularly dangerous predator. He derived pleasure from manipulating his victims and the attention he received from the media. Ramirez's fascination with satanic rituals and symbols also played a significant role in his psychological profile, adding a layer of ritualistic behavior to his crimes that Wilson did not display. Both Wilson and Ramirez demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize their violent actions, showing little to no emotional response to their crimes. This detachment is a hallmark of their psychological disorders, allowing them to act without guilt or fear of consequences. However, while Ramirez was more calculated and ritualistic in his killings, Wilson's actions were driven by impulsive rage, reflecting different psychological underpinnings. The analysis of both killers reveals the complexities of their mental states, where deep-seated issues with power, control, and identity played critical roles in shaping their behaviors. Wilson's impulsive aggression and need for dominance were manifest in his crimes, while Ramirez's psychopathy allowed him to meticulously plan and execute his horrific acts. Both men used violence as a means to exert power over their victims, but their psychological profiles reveal different paths that led to the same tragic end.
The comparison between Wade Wilson and John Wayne Gacy reveals two starkly different criminal profiles. While both men were responsible for heinous acts, their approaches to murder, manipulation, and their psychological motivations diverged greatly. Gacy was a calculated sociopath who manipulated his community and tortured his victims, whereas Wilson's crimes were more impulsive and driven by short bursts of anger. This analysis explores the methods, mindsets, and public perceptions of these two notorious criminals, illustrating how their different backgrounds shape their violent paths. Wade Wilson and John Wayne Gacy, while both notorious for their horrific crimes, displayed stark differences in their methods and interactions with victims. Gacy was infamous for luring young men and boys to his home under the guise of job opportunities or social gatherings, often manipulating his victims by posing as a trusted figure within the community. On the other hand, Wade Wilson's approach to his victims leaned more on direct violence, with less focus on manipulation and more on impulsive, brutal force. The modus operandi of Gacy was significantly more calculated. He maintained a facade of normalcy as a community figure, often dressing as a clown for children's parties, which earned him the nickname the Killer Clown. Gacy's ability to charm and deceive his victims led to his horrific acts of confinement, torture, and murder in his own home. In contrast, Wilson lacked such pretense. His attacks were overtly aggressive, leaving a clear and immediate sense of danger in his wake. Gacy's murders involved a series of rituals that included handcuffing, strangulation, and burying his victims in the crawl space of his house. These calculated steps showed Gacy's level of organization and a cold, detached demeanor. Wilson, while equally violent, showed less premeditation in his acts, suggesting a more reactive or emotionally driven approach to violence. While Gacy took his time with each victim, Wilson's killings were often rapid and chaotic, reflecting his disorganized psyche. Another critical difference lies in the way both men handled the aftermath of their crimes. Gacy went to great lengths to conceal the bodies of his victims, entombing them under his house, which allowed him to continue his killing spree for years without detection. In contrast, Wilson demonstrated less concern for covering his tracks, leading to a quicker investigation and capture. This speaks to Gacy's calculating and methodical nature, whereas Wilson seemed more impulsive, driven by short bursts of rage. The contrast in their personas also extends to how society perceived them. Gacy maintained a respectable front, involved in local politics, and was well liked in his community before his capture. His ability to mask his darkness under a friendly exterior added to the shock when his true nature was revealed. Wilson, however, never cultivated such an image, with his reputation marred by earlier signs of instability and violence. This difference in public perception made Gacy's eventual arrest more shocking, while Wilson's capture seemed inevitable based on his behavioral patterns. Despite their different approaches, both Gacy and Wilson left behind a trail of devastated families and communities. Gacy's crimes exposed the vulnerability of young men and the ease with which trust could be manipulated by predators in positions of power. Wilson's violent outbursts, on the other hand, highlighted the danger of unchecked mental health issues combined with a lack of societal support, showcasing the unpredictable nature of impulsive violence. Both killers demonstrated a complete lack of empathy toward their victims, though Gacy's manipulation skills allowed him to deceive not just his victims, but his entire community. Wilson's brutality was more transparent, making him a more obvious threat from the start. The stark contrast in their methodologies reveals how dangerous killers can emerge from vastly different psychological landscapes and societal roles, but still cause irreversible damage. Ultimately, the key difference between Gacy and Wilson lies in their premeditation and psychological manipulation. Gacy was a master of deception, hiding his true nature behind a carefully crafted facade. Wilson, in contrast, acted without such pretense, relying on brute force and immediate aggression. This difference not only shaped their crimes, but also their downfalls, with Gacy evading capture for years, while Wilson's violent tendencies led to a quicker arrest. In the midpoint comparison, Gacy's premeditation and public facade are evident. His ability to manipulate not only his victims, but also those around him allowed him to avoid capture for years. On the other hand, Wilson's impulsive nature and lack of control made his violence more transparent, leading to a quicker arrest. While Gacy used charm and deceit to lure his victims, Wilson relied on brute force. The contrast between their approaches underlines Gacy's more calculating sociopathy versus Wilson's emotional volatility. When comparing the psychological profiles of Wade Wilson and John Wayne Gacy, it becomes clear that their paths to becoming serial killers were driven by fundamentally different mental conditions. Gacy displayed classic traits of sociopathy, charm, manipulation, and a lack of remorse. His ability to seamlessly blend into society while carrying out heinous acts indicates a high level of control and planning, traits commonly associated with sociopathic behavior. Wilson, however, appears to fit more closely into a profile marked by impulse control disorders. His violent outbursts and lack of planning suggest a mind governed by momentary urges rather than long-term schemes. This distinction is crucial in understanding their motivations. Gacy's crimes were deliberate and organized, suggesting that his actions stemmed from a desire for control and domination over his victims, fitting the mold of a calculated predator. Wilson, on the other hand, was driven by rage and frustration, often reacting to immediate emotional triggers. The differences in their psychological conditions also extend to their interactions with others. Gacy thrived on manipulating people, whether it was his victims, the police, or his community. His charming and confident demeanor made him difficult to suspect, allowing him to lure victims without raising alarm. Wilson lacked this level of social manipulation. His interactions were more confrontational and aggressive, making him an easily identifiable threat. This lack of subtlety in Wilson's behavior contributed to his faster capture. While both men exhibited a profound lack of empathy, Gacy's ability to maintain long-term relationships and manipulate others for his gain points to a more insidious form of sociopathy. His actions were premeditated, often involving elaborate rituals that gave him a sense of power and control. Wilson, by contrast, seemed unable to maintain any form of stable relationship, with his erratic behavior alienating those around him. His lack of long-term planning and foresight indicates a mind consumed by immediate gratification and emotional outbursts, rather than the cold calculation seen in Gacy. Another key difference between the two lies in their treatment of their victims. Gacy's murders involved extensive physical and psychological torture, showcasing his need to dominate and dehumanize his victims before killing them. Wilson, on the other hand, was more direct in his violence, often acting out of immediate rage. His lack of ritualistic behavior indicates a psychological profile driven more by emotional instability than the desire for power and control that motivated Gacy. The trial and imprisonment of both men also offer insight into their psychological makeup. Gacy remained composed during his trial, often deflecting blame and displaying little emotion. This cold, detached demeanor is typical of sociopaths, who can compartmentalize their emotions and remain unaffected by the consequences of their actions. Wilson, by contrast, was more volatile during his trial, displaying signs of frustration and anger. His inability to control his emotions further supports the theory that his crimes were driven by impulse rather than premeditation. Despite these differences, both men shared certain traits commonly found in serial killers, such as a disregard for human life and a lack of remorse. However, Gacy's ability to mask his inner darkness with a socially acceptable exterior makes him a more dangerous figure in terms of long-term threat. Wilson, while equally deadly, lacked the social finesse to evade capture for as long, making him a less calculated but equally tragic figure in the world of serial crime. Ultimately, the comparison between Gacy and Wilson reveals two very different types of killers. Gacy's sociopathy allowed him to deceive and manipulate, hiding his true nature for years while committing horrendous crimes. Wilson's impulsivity, on the other hand, made him a more erratic and less predictable killer, driven by immediate urges rather than long-term planning. Both profiles highlight the complex psychological factors that drive individuals to commit such horrific acts, but their differences in behavior and motivation show the wide range of mental conditions that can lead to violence.
Okay, so get this right. We've got these two guys, and one, he's like the friendly face everyone knows, part of the community, the whole 9 yards. The other, total whirlwind of violence, completely different. But both, John Wayne Gacy and Wade Wilson, ended up committing, well, unspeakable acts. And that's what we're diving into, trying to understand the psychology, what makes these infamous killers tick. And we're not just, rehashing old news here. We've got expert analysis comparing and contrasting Gacy and Wilson, how they did it, their motives, their profiles, the whole shebang.
Right.
And honestly, what we found is fascinating, disturbing, no doubt. But it's a chance to get inside, see how these criminal minds work in totally different ways. So, got to start somewhere, right? Let's talk MOs, methods of operation. Because how these two went about their crimes, night and day, really. Gacy, this wasn't some, shattery figure.
No.
He was the opposite Mr. Community, the guy next door. Even dressed up as Pogo the Clown, can you believe that? For kids' parties. He used that trust he built up, that whole persona, to lure his victims in.
It's incredible.
Then you got Wilson, completely different story. We're talking impulsive, aggressive, like pure, almost animalistic violence. No charade, no hiding who he was.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? These contrasting approaches, it's a window into how different their minds work.
Yeah.
Gacy was playing the long game, all about the facade. Wilson, he was all about the moment, like a powder keg.
Yeah, like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum here, but both did these horrific things. How is that even possible?
Well, that's where the psychology comes in. Gacy, with his planning, the way he tricked people for years, that points to a calculated mind, almost predatory, It wasn't just about the killing, it was the control. Every detail, like he was a puppet master in this horrible game.
It's chilling, burying bodies under his own house, the level of planning, keeping it all hidden. It's almost too much.
And that's why Gacy is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Because he breaks the mold, it makes you realize evil doesn't always look how you'd expect. He was hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, a wolf in sheep's clothing. With Wilson, it's like the violence was more explosive, like a pressure cooker letting go. Unpredictable in a way that Gacy wasn't.
Exactly. And that's key. Gacy's control versus Wilson's impulsiveness. That's what'll help us understand what drove them both. And that's what we're going to dig into as we go deeper.
So we're back, and man, this is heavy stuff. No getting around it. But remember, the goal here isn't to be shocked or grossed out. It's to understand, right?
Absolutely.
And for that, we got to go deeper than the headlines, really get into what made these guys tick. Starting with Gacy, cuz
Wow.
you hear master manipulator and you think, okay, is that real life or just movies? But Gacy, he's like, it jumped right out of the textbook sociopath.
And that term gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
What are we really talking about here?
So it's not just being a jerk, not even just cruel. We're talking about a pattern of behavior, and a big part of it is zero empathy. No conscience, basically. Breaking rules, hurting others, and not caring at all.
Like their moral compass is just gone.
Exactly. And here's the thing. It's hidden. They can be charming, likable even. Gacy. Successful businessman, active in the community, the whole bit. It blows my mind. So that whole nice guy act, Pogo the Clown, it was an act, all to get what he wanted.
Sadly, yeah.
Yeah?
Calculated manipulation. And that need for control. That's huge GE in understanding Gacy's crimes.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about killing. It was about owning those people, like his own twisted game where he's always calling shots.
Which is just the opposite of Wilson, right? With him, it feels like lack of control is the problem. Like something just took over and he couldn't help himself.
That's a sharp insight, actually. Gacy, it was all planned, every step. Wilson, different story. This points to impulse control issues, maybe deeper mental health stuff we don't even know about.
So, not to downplay how awful it was, but Gacy planned it all out, while Wilson's was more like a reflex. A switch flipped, and that was it.
Exactly. Like, picture someone with zero temper control. No thinking about consequences, just pure reaction. And that's the key difference to keep in mind. Same horrific outcome, but the paths to get there could be more different.
Two sides of the same coin, kinda, both doing terrible things, but for totally different reasons. Gacy, in control, pulling strings. Wilson, almost controlled by his own emotions, you know?
Yeah, and it makes you think about the impact on the victims, right? How different would it have been facing one or the other?
Man, that's heavy. And we should talk about that, but let's take a second, process what we've got so far.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it's easy to get caught up in the killer's heads.
Right.
But we got to remember, the real tragedy here is the victims. Their lives, their families. Absolutely. And, you know, that's something I think about a lot. How those different ways of thinking, Gacy versus Wilson, probably changed how the experience felt for the victims, too.
Man, it's awful to think about. But you're right. What do you mean, exactly?
Well, with Gacy, right. All that manipulation, the way it was so thought out.
Yeah.
That points to a level of, like, mental torture that goes way beyond the physical stuff. Imagine thinking you're safe, that you can trust this guy, and then
it all gets ripped away in the worst way possible.
Exactly. He got off on that power, the fear he created. It's part of the whole sociopath thing.
Whereas Wilson, awful as it was a different kind of awful.
I think so. With him, it was the randomness of it. 1 minute things are normal, the next explosion. You don't even have time to understand, to fight back. It's the chaos that gets you.
So their personalities, the control freak versus the powder keg, that dictated how they committed the crimes, and what the victims went through.
It's all connected. And that's why understanding this stuff matters, not just after the fact, but maybe preventing it in the future. If we learn the signs.
Right, because there's no one-size-fits-all criminal mind, is there? It's all different based on life experiences, what's wrong in their heads. The more we get that, the better shot we have at stopping the next Gacy or Wilson before it happens.
Exactly. We can't erase evil, but we can try to understand it, shine a light on it. Maybe that's how we stop it from hurting more people.
Well said. Really makes you think. And on that note, folks, one last thought before we go. If figuring out these minds, even the darkest ones out there, if that stopped just one of these things from happening, wouldn't it be worth it? Something to chew on. Until next time, stay curious, but stay safe out there.
By the end, it's clear that while both men shared a lack of empathy for their victims, their psychological profiles set them apart. Gacy's ability to charm and control, paired with his methodical planning, contrasts sharply with Wilson's impulsive and rage-driven actions. While both were killers, Gacy's long-standing manipulation of his community marked him as a more insidious threat. Wilson, although equally dangerous, was less deceptive and more easily identified as a menace. Their cases offer insight into different types of criminal pathology and violence.
We often talk about evil, lurking beneath the surface, but some cases really make that phrase ring truer than others.
Yeah.
And today we're going to dive deep into one of those cases.
Oh, yeah?
The Wade Wilson case.
Yeah.
You probably remember it, 2019, Cape Coral, Florida. The brutal murders of Diane Ruiz and Christine Melton. Wilson was a career criminal. He was swiftly convicted. But what makes this deep dive so fascinating is that we're going to use 3 infamous cases as lenses to kind of magnify what makes the Wilson case unique. And these cases are Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Richard Ramirez.
That's like using a set of dark mirrors, right? Reflecting different aspects of criminal psychology.
Exactly.
Not to just understand what happened, but to maybe glean some insights into why it happened.
Exactly. So starting point.
Okay.
Wade Wilson, convicted in 2019, already on probation for prior offenses.
Right.
But even with his record, there was something about this case.
Well, there was a particular detail in the source material, a phone call Wilson made from jail.
Yeah.
That really struck me.
The one where he's talking about the murders.
Yeah.
And it's not remorse, it's almost like pride or boasting.
Yeah, that's it. And this lack of remorse, this potential for pride in such acts, is a classic red flag that criminologists look for.
Right.
It points to the possibility of psychopathy.
Okay.
But even that term, needs some unpacking.
So psychopath. Not all psychopaths are violent, and not all violent criminals are psychopaths.
Exactly.
But this concept seems so crucial.
Yeah.
How do investigators actually distinguish the potentially dangerous individuals from those who might not act on these impulses?
That is the question that keeps even the most seasoned experts up at night.
Yeah.
Psychopathy isn't like a straightforward diagnosis.
Right.
You can't just, check boxes on a list. It requires an in-depth psychological evaluation, a look at behavioral patterns over time, and even then there's an element of educated guesswork.
Wow.
What's interesting is that some researchers have categorized psychopaths as like primary or secondary,
Okay.
with the secondary type often driven more by impulsivity and fits of rage.
Interesting.
And that's something we'll want to consider as we examine Wilson's actions.
So we've got this potential psychopathy element.
Right.
The sources also mentioned that Wilson's victims were described as vulnerable women.
Uh-huh.
Was this intentional targeting on his part or more opportunistic?
That's a vital question in any criminal profiling.
Yeah.
With Wilson, it seems there was a blend of both.
Okay.
He definitely used charm, even deception, which is chillingly echoed in the Ted Bundy case.
Right.
But unlike Bundy, Wilson's crimes also exhibit a high degree of impulsivity.
Yeah.
What I would call uncontrolled rage,
Yeah.
not the meticulous planning we associate with someone like Bundy.
That brings us to our first dark mirror.
Yeah.
Ted Bundy.
Okay.
The name practically defines serial killer for a lot of people.
Right.
Both he and Wilson used facades manipulation. That whole wolf in sheep's clothing element.
Right.
But what I find particularly striking is how Bundy played on societal expectations.
Right.
He weaponized the trust we place in people who appear normal.
And that's where the sharp contrast emerges.
Yeah.
Bundy was a spider, patiently weaving his web. He selected his victims, meticulously planned,
Right.
even traveled across state lines to avoid detection.
Yeah.
His normal persona was carefully crafted.
Yeah.
Wilson, however, was more like a shark,
Okay.
sudden, primal, and violent.
A force of nature.
There's a quote from one profiler in the source material that I think really sums this up.
Okay.
Bundy could blend in anywhere.
Yeah.
Wilson was more of a blunt instrument.
Wow.
His aggression was overt, impossible to ignore.
So Bundy helps us see the calculated nature of some evil.
Yeah.
But are we dealing with a different kind of evil with Wilson?
Right.
Not premeditated, but rooted in something more impulsive.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is evil like a single entity?
Yeah.
Or are there types?
Mm.
And if so, does that help us prevent future crimes?
Yeah.
It's fascinating, but also frustratingly open-ended.
Absolutely. And it makes me wonder how, if at all, early intervention programs could have impacted someone like Wilson. Could those minor offenses, had they been addressed differently, have prevented this escalation? Food for thought, I suppose, as we move on to our next reflection.
Right. John Wayne Gacy, the clown killer, presents an even more chilling contrast to Bundy's calculated persona.
Yeah.
He was a community man,
Right.
active in local politics, known for entertaining at children's parties.
Yeah.
And yet, under that carefully constructed facade, he was committing horrific acts, burying bodies beneath his own house.
It's a level of deception that's almost unimaginable. I remember reading about Gacy
Yeah.
and feeling this profound sense of unease, like the world was suddenly a much less safe place.
Right.
It makes you question how well you can ever truly know someone.
That's the insidious nature of such cases, isn't it?
Yeah.
It erodes our sense of trust, our ability to discern the true nature of those around us. And yet, despite their outward differences, both Gacy and Wilson's crimes share a core element.
And by predation, we're talking about.
In this context, predation refers to the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals for exploitation and control.
Okay.
Often this involves manipulation, deception, and a chilling disregard for the victim's well-being. It's the calculated act of a hunter seeking prey.
So it's not just about the method of the crime,
Right.
but the underlying motivation, the desire to dominate and dehumanize.
Precisely, one psychologist interviewed for these sources highlighted that both Gacy and Wilson, though in vastly different ways, exhibited a profound need for control,
Right.
which, when coupled with a lack of empathy, creates a truly dangerous combination.
While Wilson didn't cultivate a public persona like Gacy, I'm now wondering if there were subtler ways he might have used deception to gain access to his victims.
Yeah.
Did he present a false sense of security?
Okay.
Were there elements of manipulation that we haven't fully considered?
That's an excellent point, and worthy of further investigation after all, even without a clown suit, so to speak.
Right.
Wilson could have employed tactics to disarm his victims, to lull them into a false sense of safety.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that evil often operates in the shadows cloaked in normalcy.
Ramirez's case, however, presents a chilling contrast to Gacy's meticulously crafted persona.
Yeah.
He embraced the darkness, reveled in the fear he generated, the Night Stalker, terrorizing California with seemingly random acts of violence, satanic symbols. It's straight out of a horror film.
And unlike Wilson, Ramirez seemed driven by a desire for notoriety.
Okay.
He wanted the spotlight, the infamy. His darkness was projected outward, aimed at creating widespread panic and chaos.
So two very different expressions of evil again, but surely there's some common ground.
Of course, the most striking parallel is the sheer scale of suffering inflicted.
Right.
Both men left a trail of trauma and devastation in their wake. Ramirez, through his campaign of terror, Wilson, through his brutal and personal acts of violence, it forces us to ask, what can we learn from cases like these, where the motives are so drastically different, yet the outcome is so devastatingly similar?
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned earlier that trying to understand the why behind these acts can be frustratingly open-ended.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to think that even that frustration, that lack of easy answers, is valuable.
Okay.
It forces us to grapple with the complexity of human behavior,
Right.
to acknowledge that there's no simple equation for evil.
I completely agree. And it compels us to look beyond the surface, to examine the societal factors, the psychological vulnerabilities, the individual circumstances that contribute to these acts.
Yeah.
It's not about excusing behavior,
Right.
but about understanding it so we can perhaps one day prevent it.
So we've looked at the calculated evil of Bundy, the deceptive evil of Gacy, and the chaos-driven evil of Ramirez.
Right.
Each reflection reveals a different facet of Wade Wilson's case, but it's still unclear where he truly fits within this spectrum.
And that's precisely what makes this deep dive so compelling. We're not just rehashing familiar stories. We're using them as tools to dissect a case that on the surface might seem straightforward, but upon closer examination reveals a chilling complexity.
And it's in that complexity and those nuances that we might just find the insights we're searching for.
Yeah.
So let's turn our attention back to Wilson himself. We've explored the broader landscape of evil. Now it's time to analyze the specific details of his crimes to see what they reveal about his motivations, his psychological state, and ultimately what makes him a uniquely disturbing figure in the annals of true crime. So we've used Bundy, Gacy, and Ramirez as our, dark mirrors reflecting different aspects of criminal psychology.
Right.
Now, with those reflections in mind, let's refocus on Wade Wilson.
Okay.
We've seen that evil can be meticulously planned or shockingly impulsive. Where does Wilson fit on that spectrum?
That's the puzzle we're trying to piece together, isn't it? And it's here that the details of the Wilson case become really crucial. The sources really emphasize his impulsivity, the explosive rage that seemed to drive his actions.
Yeah.
It wasn't the cold, calculated predation of a Bundy.
Right.
It was something raw.
And if we tie that back to the possibility of psychopathy you mentioned earlier,
Uh-huh.
could Wilson fit that profile of a secondary psychopath?
Yeah.
Driven by rage rather than meticulous planning?
It's certainly a strong possibility. The sources mention a psychologist's evaluation of Wilson,
Yeah.
noting a history of violent outbursts,
Okay.
a quickness to anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation.
Right.
This isn't someone who was carefully plotting his moves like Bundy.
Yeah.
This is someone operating from a place of immediate visceral emotion.
Which makes that phone call from jail all the more disturbing.
Right.
It wasn't just a lack of remorse. It was almost as if he was reliving the violence,
Yeah.
drawing energy from it.
That's a chilling observation. And you're right, it's distinct from the calculated, almost theatrical grandiosity we see in someone like Ramirez.
Right.
Wilson's darkness wasn't performative.
Yeah.
It was something festering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt.
And erupts in ways that defy easy categorization.
Right.
He used charm and deception, echoing Bundy. But then there's this brutal, uncontrolled element that sets him apart. It's almost as if he was two different people,
Yeah.
a Jekyll and Hyde.
That duality is perhaps what makes him so uniquely disturbing.
Right.
You know, it scrambles our usual understanding of how these types of criminals operate. It challenges the frameworks we use to try and make sense of such senseless acts.
So if we're stepping back to consider the bigger picture, the so what of all this,
Yeah.
what does Wade Wilson teach us about the nature of evil, about the darkness that exists in the world?
I think he forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always fit neatly into our preconceived notions.
Right.
It can be a storm that gathers slowly and deliberately, or it can be a sudden, devastating earthquake.
Yeah.
And that makes it all the more difficult to predict, to prevent.
We've spent a lot of time focused on the perpetrators, on trying to understand their motives, their psychology. But we can't forget the victims.
Of course.
Diane Ruiz and Christine Melton, their families, their friends.
Right.
The ripple effect of these crimes is immeasurable.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that behind every headline, every case file, are real people whose lives have been shattered.
Yeah.
And it underscores the responsibility we all have to look for those warning signs.
Right.
To speak up, to intervene when possible. Even the smallest act of kindness of awareness could make a difference.
We started this deep dive looking to understand what made Wade Wilson's case unique. We've seen the echoes of Bundy, Gacy, and Ramirez.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Wilson stands alone, a chilling example of how evil can defy categorization.
And perhaps that's the most important takeaway of all.
Yeah.
We may never fully understand what drives individuals to commit such acts.
Right.
But by continuing to explore, to question, to challenge your assumptions.
Yeah. We can hopefully move closer to a world where such tragedies are less frequent, less devastating.
A powerful thought to end on.
Yeah.
We'll leave you with that and with the memory of the candlelight vigil held for Diane and Christine.
Right.
A community coming together to grieve, to heal, to remind themselves that even in the face of darkness, light can and will prevail.